The square always pretended to know nothing. It accepted the cries of merchants and the prayers of pilgrims as calmly as the morning breeze. Someone left a flatbread for a hungry dog on the stone curb. A little further away, someone lowered their eyes, covering a tray with forbidden items, and it seemed as if this order was eternal. But in those days, order in this city barely clung to the edges of the stones. The old rules of decency were crumbling. New ones had not yet been born, and everyone considered themselves a judge. I am glad to see you and ask you to write in the comments where you are watching this video from. I am really interested. I wish you pleasant listening. In that year, which would later be remembered as a year of rain and controversy, the square still remembered how a table was set up for the elders, and how the scribe laid out wet scrolls in the sun. At the edge of the square stood the widow Agatha's shop. She sold candles, salt, and herbs, and often saw more than she would have liked. On the opposite side sat the jester Juan, small, thin, with a crooked hat. They teased him, and he responded with silence. Sometimes it seemed as if he was counting the cracks in the slabs and keeping them as someone else's secrets. The scribe Luke lived next to the office and walked across the square in the evenings when the merchants were closing their stalls and the boys were chasing crows from the bell tower. Luke was one of those who loved order in words. He checked letters and rewrote the old market regulations, which stated what was allowed in the square and what was not. But life went on ahead of his lines. It became crowded with musicians, barkers, and jugglers. Pilgrims began to set up tables with gifts right at the steps of the temple. The city constable Martin grumbled that this was not right, saying that the former strictness must be restored. He liked to repeat that the square had honor and should not tolerate indecency. Luke wrote down his words in a draft and doubted. Too much had already changed, and everyone interpreted the word indecency in their own way. Agatha's widow had an assistant, Eva, a teenage girl and an orphan. She knew how to read the marks on grain sacks, and it seemed like a trifle, but that was how she learned to distinguish between other people's marks, seals, and knots. Agatha said that Eva had a good eye. No one knew that in the evenings the girl would look at the ancient slab by the fountain, where old inscriptions were carved. She tried to understand them without a teacher, comparing them with the notes on the temple boards. She liked that the stone preserved memory, and that this memory had clear boundaries, where you could play, where you couldn't swear, where you had to be quiet. No one paid any attention to this. Eva was one of those who were not heard. One early morning, Luke found a woven basket with a narrow neck at the office door. A simple rope hung from it, tied in a knot like a salt bag, but the rope was unusual. A thin red thread was woven into it, and only one person in the city made it. Master Vicenti, the head of the Weavers' Guild. Luca noticed this in passing and put the thought aside. He took the basket inside and placed it by the table, deciding that it was a sample for collecting donations. The day before, the elders had talked about the fountain and cleanliness. At noon, Constable Martin demanded that the basket be opened, claiming that someone was distributing indecent items in the square. Luke lifted the lid and felt the air in the room grow heavy. Inside were small clay figures, roughly molded with exaggerated details, and sheets of rhymes where swear words were intertwined with the names of respected people. Martin turned pale. He said that this was a sign of moral decline, and that an exemplary punishment must be carried out, otherwise the city would sink into filth. Luke averted his gaze because he felt not only shame, but also someone's intention. The basket had been planted carefully, at the right time and in the right place. On the same day, inspections began in the square. Martin stopped singers, forced women to cover their hair more tightly, and took away the tambourines from the town criers if their songs sounded too cheerful. The townspeople endured until evening, and then they began to grumble. Merchants said that their profits were being ruined. pilgrims complained that they were being yelled at as if they were shameless. The elders argued. The jester Juan sat in the shade and did not show his face. He knew that the noise would die down and he would be forgotten again. Eva watched Martin hand out punishments. His gaze was stern, but occasionally a shadow flashed across his eyes as he walked around the fountain. The girl noticed something strange. Martin was drawn to the ancient slab with inscriptions, as if it were something familiar. He stood half a step closer to it than necessary, and sometimes, as if by accident, touched its edge with his palm. The widow Agatha once said that such gestures are characteristic of people with a good memory for things. Her words stuck in Eva's mind and helped her to piece together small clues into patterns. 3 days later, something happened that would later be remembered in the square as a time of alarm. A messenger came to Agatha's shop with a bag. He said the bag was for the office, asked her to give it to Luke, and not to delay. Eva took the bag, and while Agatha was distracted, she felt a chill in her hand. The bag did not contain wax or parchment. It contained iron and glass. The girl remembered the basket, the rope with the red thread, and felt the same viscous determination. She did not open the bag. She took it out into the yard and hid it under a water barrel. It seemed like a simple thing to do, but at that moment, Juan appeared, sat down next to her, and without looking at her, repeated a phrase he had heard the day before from the weavers. Master Vincent had told his students to be ready to shout in the square, saying that the noise was necessary for the good of the guild. The girl asked how he knew this. Joan replied without a smile that he remembered all the city announcements, even those spoken in a whisper. He said that people thought he was empty-headed because he did not respond to them with words, but he was simply saving his words so that he could use them at the right moment. When the bag was opened in the office, it was too late. Inside were pieces of glass with etched drawings and metal plates with inscriptions that contained mockery instead of prayers. Someone was preparing a show in the square that was supposed to humiliate the council and the temple, and then point to the simple merchants as the culprits. Martin took this as an excuse to be even stricter. He demanded that the jesters disappear and that the singers remain silent until the elders announced a different order. Luke wrote down the demand and for the first time added a line of his own hand, stating that the old statutes of the square, carved in stone by the fountain, did not correspond to current customs and should be revised. He was not a daredevil, but he understood that if new clarity was not offered, fear and profit would rule the square. That night, Ivy returned to the slab by the fountain. She traced the letters with her finger and tried to connect them with what she had seen during the day. An old bell ringer stopped nearby, leaning on his staff. He said that when he was a boy, a monk from a mountain monastery taught him to read, and that the stones spoke simple things, that you could trade in the square until the evening bell, that you could sing praises through work, not words, that swearing at honest people was forbidden, that dice games were only allowed by the wall behind which the temple could not be seen. Eva asked him to repeat it. The old man repeated it slowly, as if afraid of making a mistake. The girl realized that she held the key in her hands. She knew that Martin was still resisting, and Luke was looking for support. She decided to bring them the words of the stone. The morning was cold. Luke met Eva at the fountain. She repeated the old man's words about the stone and added that she could show him the faded lines of old letters. Luke listened attentively. He said that such support would help relieve some of the tension, but the rest would require new rules as a continuation of the ancient ones. At that moment, a woman in a gray cloak stood in the shadow of a column, her face covered with a veil. She listened to the conversation, but gave nothing away. Only Juan noticed her. Sergeant Martin gathered the people and announced that from now on, any mockery in the square would be punished with the whip. The crowd gasped. Then the widow Agatha came to the fountain, accompanied by Iva, Luke, and the old bell ringer. They told of the inscriptions, retold their meaning, and asked that the old words become the measure for the new ones. Martin listened, but remained stern. He repeated that laughter and dancing breed debauchery. Then the jester Juan suddenly raised his head and said, without joking, that he had heard Martin many times and remembered his words. He recalled how, back in the spring, the bailiff had said that he did not want the old riots to be repeated in the city, when the crowd, under the guise of decency, had destroyed the shops of foreigners. Juan recounted how Martin had promised to uphold the truth, even if it was inconvenient for the guilds. People began to whisper. Juan, who had been considered a nobody, turned out to be a man with a sharp memory. The conversation took a turn. It was the first shift. The underestimated became the pillar of support. At that moment, the woman in the veil appeared at the fountain. She announced through Luke that she was willing to pay for the cleaning of the square and the repair of the notice board if the council agreed to write down the new rules openly, in front of the people, and to base them on stone and common sense. She added that the council would have to ban name-calling and allow songs until the evening bell, and allow fairground jesters to perform on a separate side of the square, away from the temple. Her voice was even. The people exchanged glances. Martin replied that money was not an argument, but if the council agreed and the church did not object, he would accept an arrangement in which noise would not be considered profanity. The next day, Luke began to draw up a new set of rules. He walked around the square, asking the guilds and pilgrims what they needed for peaceful trade and prayer. The elders frowned, but saw that the tension was easing. Only Master Vincent remained silent, marking pieces of fabric. His silence was velvety and sticky, like damp cloth. By noon, anxiety had returned. Under a bench at the steps of the temple, they found a scroll with obscene lines, signed with the name of João. The jester turned pale. He was taken to the basement of the office. The crowd began to buzz. Someone whispered that the underrated hero turned out to be a vulgar man after all. Eva remembered the red thread on the basket rope and asked Martin to let her look at the scroll. She saw that the knot on the ribbon was tied in the same way as on Vincent's cloth bags. She said it was the same knot. Martin dismissed her, saying that the knot proved nothing. He ordered João to be prepared for punishment in a day. That same night, Eva returned to the stove and noticed Martin there. The bailiff stood in the dim light, holding onto the stone edge as if it were a railing by the water. Eva saw that he had a small wooden plaque hanging around his neck with a carved symbol, the same as on the old ribbon that Agatha used to tie Iva's hair when she was very little. The girl asked the widow where the ribbon came from. Agatha sighed and told a long story. Once a stranger came to her, left a baby and a ribbon with a request to take care of it. She said that the child's father served in the city, that he had a sign on a board carved by a craftsman from the monastery mountain. Iva realized that Martin's sign was the same. She remained silent until dawn, and then went to Luke. Luke, looking at Martin's plaque and Ava's ribbon, realized that there was a connection between them. He said that he did not know the whole truth, but he saw in this a family bond that stretched back through the years. This was the second shift. The hidden kinship became visible, although no one had yet spoken it aloud. The day of execution approached. Poles were erected in the square, and ropes were stretched. People averted their eyes, because any execution is a test not only for the condemned. The widow Agatha brought Martin to the fountain and asked him to listen to Ivy. Luke stood nearby, holding a scroll with the new rules. Suddenly, a woman in a veil emerged from the crowd. She said that she could only remove her veil in the square, and only in front of witnesses, because her name was connected with the city. She lifted her veil. People saw her stern features and the silver rim on her hair, the same kind worn by sisters from an ancient family of knights. She called herself the sister of Sir Roland, the very man who had once saved the city from robbers and disappeared on a distant campaign. She said that her brother had left her some money and a letter asking her if she wished to help cities that lacked clear rules and clean water. She added that she was married to a weaver from a neighboring town and knew the value of guild power. Her appearance was the third turning point. An unexpected benefactor intervened openly, shifting the conversation from fear to order and honor. She asked Luca to read aloud parts of the new code, then gestured to João. She told Martin that the jester remembered not only the mockery, but also the vows made to the guild in the square, and asked him to give him the floor. Martin agreed, invoking the honor of the woman's family. João stepped forward and recited the weaver's oath from 5 years ago. He read the lines where Master Vicentio promised to observe strict silence on temple days, not to use the confusion of the crowd to his advantage, and not to insult another man's wife with songs. The crowd began to whisper. Someone remembered the red thread. Someone remembered the bag and the knot. Luca turned to Vincent and asked if the master was ready to confirm his oath. He replied that he was not obliged to answer a windbag. Then Iva picked up the ribbon and asked the master to show his favorite knots. He tried to turn away, but his students were already whispering because the knot on the scroll was their trademark. The square fell silent. Constable Martin stepped forward and said that it all looked like children's games, but the recognizable knot, the scroll under the temple steps, and the red thread on the basket were a chain. He added that he could be wrong, but the lie was too hasty. He looked at Eva as if he were seeing her for the first time. She stood with the ribbon pressed to her chest. At that moment, the widow Agatha made up her mind and told what she had been hiding for years. She said that Eva had been brought to her when she was a baby, and that the child had that very ribbon. She added that the mark on the ribbon matched the mark on Martin's tablet. The crowd gasped. It was the fourth shift. The hidden kinship had become apparent. Martin swayed, as if the blow had come at the wrong moment, and then quietly said that if this was true, he himself was on trial before his conscience, because he had almost punished an innocent person in front of his own blood. He did not cry. He just put away the whip and asked Luke to continue reading the code so that the city would have clear words before its eyes, not the passions of others. Luca read that trading was allowed in the square until the evening bell, and after that, the stalls had to be cleared away so as not to disturb the night's silence. He read that songs and performances were allowed on the east side, away from the steps of the temple, provided that they did not contain profanity with the names of living and deceased townspeople. He announced the rule that disputes between guilds must be brought to a wooden platform under the supervision of 2 scribes and 1 witness from among the pilgrims, so that an outside eye would keep honor from being wronged. He added a clause that shouting and pushing were prohibited at the fountain because water was a common good. People nodded. The old bell ringer sat by the stone and smiled. It was important to him that the memory of the stone was not forgotten. Juan sat nearby and quietly repeated the words to preserve them. Master Vincent listened to all this with a stony face. When the word came to the point about banning swear words, he raised his hand sharply and said that conscience does not need paper. He added that all these rules were invented by cowards who are afraid of loud laughter, and laughter, as we know, is cleansing. He spoke these words so loudly that the square echoed with a hum. Then, the woman in the veil, now without her veil, calmly recounted how such laughter had cost her husband his place in the guild, and brought shame upon their home when leaflets with slanderous lines that had nothing to do with the truth were thrown into the market. She said she had seen laughter turn into a weapon. Her calmness was stronger than shouting. People began to speak differently, and yet Immediate clarity did not come. At night, someone spread the sheets out again in the square and hung a figure with a mocking gesture on the lamppost at the entrance to Agatha's shop. Eva got up in the dark, took a broom, and went to sweep up the paper. Jerome followed her, picking up the sheets and putting them in a basket. He said that if they left it all lying around, by noon, people would no longer be able to distinguish between clean and dirty. He repeated that ears quickly get used to everything, and then trouble begins. Around noon, the older brother of one of the weaver's apprentices appeared in the office. He was trembling and said that he had gone out to the workshops at night and saw Vincent and several people carrying out sacks. He said that they were arguing about how to plant the scrolls under the temple steps, who should play the role of an indignant spectator, and who should report to the police that he had seen the jester distributing the sheets. Luke wrote down his words and asked for details. The young man said that the knot on the bags was the same one, with red thread. He said he was afraid, but he could no longer remain silent. He could have been considered a coward, but at that moment he became braver than many. Luca went to Martin and demanded a search. Martin nodded, and together they headed for the workshops. At the gate, they were met by apprentices, but they did not dare to block their way. Inside, behind piles of fabric, they found new scrolls, iron plates, and figurines. Martin looked at them without joy. He said that he was speaking as a man, not as a bailiff. It was easier for them all to impose order with a whip than to work for clarity, and in doing so, they had given Vicentia free rein. He admitted his mistake. Then he ordered the master to be bound so that he could appear before the council. The city was preparing for the trial. The square was cordoned off, and a platform was erected. Luke climbed onto the platform with the new vault, the woman benefactor, the old bell ringer, and the pilgrim, a passerby with clear eyes who was chosen as the third witness. Juan stood nearby at the steps of the platform. Below, among the people, stood the widow Agatha, holding Eve by the hand. Martin brought Vincent forward and announced that the case was not about blasphemy or freedom of laughter, but about the abuse of words as weapons, about the substitution of decency with cunning, about the attempt to rule the city through fear and dirty joy. He pointed to the ropes with red thread, to the scrolls found in the workshop, and to the coincidence of the knots. Vincent replied that all this was a lie spread by enemies. He said that people had always laughed in the square, and no one had ever been harmed by laughter. He added that the Weavers' Guild fed the city, and who would dare to teach it decency? Then Joan raised his hand and asked Luke to allow him to repeat the old announcements. Luke nodded. Joan listed the mocking lines that had been thrown around at night and matched them to the names of the people they referred to. He showed how these lines coincided with the disputes in the council, where Vincent demanded a place for his guild by the fountain and a share of the salt tax. He did not speak beautifully. He simply put fact upon fact. The crowd listened. It was the moment when the man they used to dismiss as a joke became the voice of memory and reason. The benefactor woman raised her hand and asked the pilgrim to speak. The pilgrim said that he had seen similar things in other cities, and that where decency was combined with clear rules, the market grew stronger, and where it was based on fear or ridicule, everything fell apart. He said that an outsider's perspective is useful because it is not involved in local politics. His words sounded dry, but they were useful. Luca read the final draft of the code. It included a rule about a place for performances, a ban on name-calling, a time of silence at the temple, a platform for disputes, and the duty of town criers to read the code aloud on the first day of the week without embellishment. He added a clause stating that throwing sheets of paper with names on them would be punished by labor. The guilty party would have to wash the area around the fountain at dawn for 3 days while people went to the market. This clause was born not out of malice, but out of common sense. Those who pollute with words should clean the stone. The council agreed. The temple did not object. The square breathed a sigh of relief. Vicentia was found guilty of verbal abuse and secret tampering. He was punished with labor and deprived of his seat on the guild council for a year. His students were given the right to remain in the workshops under the guidance of another master. This was important, to punish the leader and preserve the work. After the trial, the benefactor woman approached Martin and Eve. She said that the city would have clean water. The fountain would be repaired at her expense. She asked that new lines be carved on the stone nearby, not to replace the old ones, but to continue them. Eva promised to help choose the words. She asked for a small leaf symbol to be carved nearby, in honor of those who cleaned the square. Martin agreed. He took a small board from around his neck and said he could no longer carry it as a secret. He recognized Eva as his blood. The crowd did not shout as if it were a miracle. People just nodded. Everyone had their own knots, and some saw for the first time how knots could be untied without shouting. There was less noise. The musicians were taken to the east side. Jugglers performed until the evening bell. Town criers read the code without embellishment. The jester Juan stood nearby and whispered forgotten words at the right moment so that the text sounded accurate. Luke continued his work. He made sure that what was written did not rise above what was alive. He saw how the code outlived itself, how once pilgrims asked for permission to sing psalms of praise at the fountain on a holiday, and how the council allowed it on the condition that trade would stop for an hour. He recorded the changes and made notes in the margins. Rules are born of consent, not fear. Some time passed. People got used to the platform for disputes. Sometimes it was noisy there, but the noise came from the edges of the vault without disturbing the middle. The widow Agatha hung bundles of herbs above the entrance, and no one was afraid anymore that her shop would be called indecent. The old bell ringer led the boys to the stone and taught them not words, but meaning. Decency is not a prohibition of joy or a permission for filth. It is a boundary that helps us live together. Joan began to smile sometimes. He was still stingy with words, but those he did utter became a sign of decency in themselves. Nothing superfluous. Once, knights came to the city, knights who had not been here for a long time. They brought people from distant lands, and the square was once again deafened by shouts and laughter. In the evening, one of the knights stopped at the stone, read the new lines, and said that the city had a good memory. His words were conveyed to Luke. Luca thought that the memory of the square was not the silence of the stone, but the intertwining of many footsteps and voices. He remembered the basket, the red thread, the bag, the knots, the hypocritical laughter, and the quiet work, and then wrote the last note in the margins. The vault works as long as people support it with their deeds. If the arch is left on paper, it will be eaten away by dampness. Therefore, every morning, someone must sweep the square before trading and performances begin, and someone must read the text before the laughter becomes too loud. By evening, the same faces had gathered at the fountain: the veiled benefactor, Martin, Eva, the widow Agatha, the old bell ringer, Luke, and Juan. They did not celebrate. They just stood and watched the water running smoothly and quietly. Each had their own role, and each role became part of the city's decorum. Martin no longer held the whip before speaking. Eva no longer hid the ribbon. The benefactor woman no longer hid her face. Juan was no longer afraid of his words. Luke was no longer afraid to edit what he had written. The square was still the same, but it had become a little stronger. After a period of calm trade, new people took to the platform. They argued about the price of salt, the timing of holidays, and the order of weighing scales. The jester stood nearby and nodded when he heard the right words. The widow Agatha was busy with herbs again and taught Eva how to make a decoction for the town criers' throats. The old bell ringer passed the bell to another. The benefactor woman left for the next town. Before leaving, she left a letter asking not to forget why it all began, not for silence for the sake of silence, but for justice without shame. Since then, there have still been quarrels and even fights in the square, but people have been able to quell them because they now have their own responsibilities. If someone tried to throw a dirty sheet of paper with a name on it again, they would be seen with a broom by the fountain in the morning. If someone tried to hide behind laughter when their words were malicious, they were asked to stand on the platform and listen to the arch until they understood that excessive laughter was also a form of violence. If someone forgot that decency was a common boundary, they were reminded of the old lines on the stone and the new lines of the arch, and no one shouted. That's how the rules changed, not through fire and brimstone, but through hard work and clarity. When Luca grew old, he left a final note in the margins. Propriety in the square is like a knot on a ribbon. It cannot be imposed like a whip. It cannot be removed like a hat. It can only be woven into every day. He understood that this knot was held together by those who had not been heard before. He remembered Iva, who learned to read stone without a teacher, and understood that talent from below changes the order not with a shout, but with precision. He remembered Juan, who led the city out of the fear of night with his memory. He remembered the woman benefactor who put money into work, not into boasting. He remembered the hidden kinship that prevented the whip from falling on the innocent. All these knots and lines came together in a new pattern, and this pattern became not a decoration, but a measure. The old tiles by the fountain sometimes glistened in the twilight, as if water pulsed within them. People passed by, muttering their worries, unaware that by walking around the stone, they were repeating an ancient route each time. The square no longer pretended to be unaware. It knew that one could trade and sing there until the evening bell, that one must not throw dirty sheets with names on them, that disputes must be taken to the platform, that water must be conserved. It knew that decency was not a prohibition on laughter or a permission to humiliate, but a simple rule: do not do to others what you would be ashamed to do yourself in front of your neighbors. It knew that rules change over time, but they change where people are willing to take responsibility for them. So in this city, in those years that would be called the years of rain and controversy, a new habit was born. People stopped waiting for others to tell them how to live. They wrote and read aloud the rules of their square themselves. And when strangers came to the square, they saw not strictness or looseness, but honest order. Those who laughed loudly and maliciously left with nothing, while those who brought work and clean water stayed and became part of the pattern. This was the ultimate justice. No one won with a single blow, but everyone got their place, and those who wanted to rule through fear lost their power. Those who were underestimated became heard. Those who hid their kinship found each other. The square lived through this lesson, and the stone remembered. Propriety is not a stone mask, but a living agreement, where every surprise is visible in advance to those who are not too lazy to look at the details.